I'm Jerry Gordon, senior editor of the New English Review, and I'm here with Dr. Stephen Bryen, a noted military technologist, former defense company executive, and currently a columnist for the Asia Times. Let's go start with Afghanistan. What is your takeaway on the tragic drone and missile strike, using a Hellfire missile, by the way, in Kabul on August the 29th? Took the life of an Afghan aid worker and his family members.
Well, you know, the Defense Department has rather belatedly come and said it was a mistake, that they made an error. And that's the official line. After, of course, the Joint Chiefs Chairman, the General Milley, called it a righteous strike on the enemies of America, you know, killing ISIS people. Well, they killed a bunch of children, 7 children, 3 adults. One of them was an aid worker working for a nonprofit, voluntary private organization working with malnourished people. The real question is, how they got it so wrong? You know, how did they mess this up? You know, they violated all the kind of normal rules of engagement for using Hellfire or Predator drones or Reaper drones. I think this was a Reaper against their targets, and it seems like they could have taken this guy out if that's who they really thought was the right target before he came to his home, before he was in a deeply populated area. But they waited to the last minute and then they hit him. So there's something going on here in the chain of command. When one of these strikes takes place, it takes very high level approval. The operators don't approve it. They provide the information, and then the judgment is made up the chain of command. We don't know who made that judgment. We don't know at all. But my guess is there was a lot of urgency in the White House to somehow show that they could fight against somebody, and they decided to fight against ISIS, what they call ISIS /K, meaning ISIS Kabul. And so they did this atrocity. It's all you can call it, as an atrocity. Yet now they've announced that they're going to investigate it, but the investigator is the Air Force IG, the Inspector General of the Air Force, not an independent investigation by any stretch of the imagination. And it's very unusual for an Inspector General to condemn his chain of command. It's been done, but it's not very normal. So I'm not very optimistic that we'll get to the truth through this investigation. Now, Congress could investigate. They made a lot of noise, but they haven't done anything. But we don't have the whole story, but the whole story is not a nice one.
The weapon involved was a Hellfire missile.
That's right.
Once those are launched, there's no take back on that.
That's right. The Hellfire, once it's launched from the drone, it takes around 30 seconds to hit its target. And in that 30 seconds, it can't be called back. It can't be diverted. It's over with. The Israelis in the Obama administration, they had been using Hellfires. And when Obama canceled the Hellfire, they decided to adapt the Spike missile, their Spike missile, which was an anti-tank missile, for use on their helicopters and probably on their drones, although I can't confirm that. But the Spike missile has a feature that the Hellfire doesn't, which is that it can be diverted to a different target or to no target at all, or it can be destroyed by the operator. And of course, as you know, and everybody knows because it's been in the papers, the CIA allegedly warned after the rocket was launched, the Hellfire rocket, that there were children there in that space. And had there been a possibility of calling this thing back, it would have been done, but there wasn't any. Well, I don't know if the story is entirely true, whether it has veracity. But in any case, there's a major problem with what is called fire and forget weapons. And it's not the first time. I mean, we've had these kinds of incidents in the past in Yugoslavia in the war there, Kosovo, and also in Belgrade. On two occasions, one case blew up a train because we didn't know it was going to cross a bridge, and we had fired at the bridge, and then the train came, and it took the Maverick missile about 20 minutes to get to its target, and by that time the target had changed, and there was a train there, killed 10 people. And then we blew up a bus, a civilian bus, blew it in half and killed 7 or 10 Albanian school children. Terrible. But I mean, again, these are things that are weaknesses in fire and forget. Once you've launched, there's no way to stop it again. And that's something that shouldn't be allowed. We should do better than that. We should redesign our system so that we can adjust in case there's some reason to. Look, the Israelis have gone to extreme lengths to try to minimize human casualties in their battle against Hamas in particular, but also against Hezbollah. Because they don't want, there's two reasons why you don't want to do this. I mean, one is ethical. If you don't want to kill people who are not combatants, who have no role in the fighting and essentially are collateral damage. You don't want to do that ethically. But there's another reason which is equally valid and important. When you do it, you create enemies, and those enemies never forget what you did. So it's counterproductive politically, as well as it's ethically unacceptable.
What does it say about the credibility of the Biden administration counterterrorism strategy of, quote, using over-the-horizon attacks to deal with, quote, terrorist enemies, whether they're in Afghanistan or elsewhere?
Well, it reminds me of what Obama was doing. It's almost the same thing, isn't it? I mean,
Yep.
launch some kind of a Predator or other drone, or we were using cruise missiles, okay, to try and attack Taliban and Al Qaeda and all that sort of thing. And I think that this is not really a very good strategy. First of all, because you're bound to kill a lot of civilians, so it's not clean, and that's a key problem. Secondly, the intelligence is always a little bit wonky. If you don't have people on the ground and you're not looking them in the eye, you don't know if you got the right people. So you may launch something and end up killing the wrong person, or not killing anybody, just missing the target. You missed a lot of targets, especially with the cruise missiles. So I think that Mr. Biden's policy, if that's what you want to call it, is not really much of a policy.
Does the U.S. really have any eyes or ears on the ground, so to speak, at that vicinity these days?
Well, it must have some, but I think it's less than we would like. And look, unfortunately, a lot of intelligence has shifted to the technological. Spy satellites, overhead cameras, things of that sort, sensors of all kinds. But not what we call in the business human intelligence. Human is all important. One of the things the Israelis have obviously specialized in is human. That's why things blow up in Iran, for example, that we would never dream of trying to do because we don't have the intelligence. They do it.
How badly did the Biden administration withdrawal go in terms of poisoning U.S. relations with key allies in the region?
Well, that's been going on for a while. This was just the added to it. Let's put it that way. The loss of Afghanistan, the walkout, I would call it, the abandonment, just told everybody what they already sort of knew. that the U.S. is not very reliable and you can't trust the United States. I think that was the message. Look, they pulled all the air defense missiles, I'm talking about Biden, out of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, to appease Iran. That's all it was about. And of course, making it much easier for the Houthis, which is a proxy of Iran, to launch missiles against Saudi and UAE, which they've been doing, and drones and other stuff, which they've been doing. Why that was done is, we were trying to flatter the Iranians. We also declared that the Houthis weren't terrorists. They just executed, 9 people in cold blood for no reason in public, in terrible shootings. I mean, these are bloodthirsty people, and they are terrorists. But Biden doesn't think so. And it goes on and on. This is, I think it's going to get worse. I mean, this is a sort of leftist ideology, nonsense ideology, which is getting us in a lot of trouble. And by leaving our allies like Saudi and UAE on their own, I mean, the Saudis are talking to the Russians. They've already made a defense agreement with the Russians. That would be unheard of in the past, but they've done it because they see the handwriting on the wall. So in the Middle East, the U.S. posture is very damaged. But it's not only in the Middle East. I mean, if you go out into the Pacific area, it's created a very great nervousness. And no one is sure, and I'm not either, that the U.S. will defend what are specific American interests in the region, whether it's Japan or Korea or whether it's Taiwan. I mean, there's a lot of, I'm very skeptical that we're going to defend any of them. Whatever and I don't mean about words. There's a tendency in this administration to speak a lot and do little. Essentially carry no stick and have a big mouth. And that's what they are. That's the danger. It's very dangerous.
You've written recently about a forthcoming so-called Quad meeting.
Yes.
Japan, India, and I guess another ally.
Australia.
Yes, Australia.
Biden can't remember the prime minister's name, but it's them guys down there.
His name is Morrison, as it turns out.
Right. That's right. Not too hard to remember.
And it is relatively bizarre because the Japanese prime minister looks like he's despised by his own party.
Well, he's resigned. I mean, the Japanese prime minister has already resigned. He's just waiting for the party to choose the next leader. There's a contest going on in Japan. He has no authority whatever. So why did he come here? What's he doing here? Morrison, his country is in uproar over the COVID business. There were reports of shootings by the police against protesters yesterday in Melbourne. I mean, it's very nasty. He should be there. I mean, not in Washington. What's he doing in Washington when he has this kind of crisis at home? And then the sub deal, which he's made with the US and with the UK, is very controversial in Australia. Very controversial and not well accepted. Not only that, but it's controversial in a lot of other places. The Chinese hate it, but they hate it because they hate it. I mean, it's not really going to make any difference to China, but they hate it because they need to hate it. But the French hate it. And the French, are very angry because they lost billions of dollars in jobs and work. And they're threatening to go through the EU, and the EU is threatening too, to cancel a trade agreement between the EU and Australia. If that happens, Australians are going to suffer because 50% of the wine is being one of their top exports. 50% of the wine that Australia produces is consumed in the EU, not to mention lamb and mutton and beef, all coming from Australia. So they're going to get whacked in the face over this thing. and they didn't need to be. There were more clever ways to do this than the way it's been. The way it's been done is really improper because they did it secretly. They quickly reached this agreement. The Australians quickly threw out the French, where they had a contract, and said, "We're not doing it with the French. We're doing it with the U.S. and UK." I mean, I don't really blame Macron for being very unhappy. Why not? Of course, he's unhappy. But it doesn't do much for Australia. It doesn't do much for the U.S. The UK, I'm not so sure, but it doesn't really do much for them either. So it's a bit of a catastrophe for the Australians on both sides of the coin, and they have they really shouldn't be having a tea with Mr. Biden. Doesn't make sense.
The other member of the Quad is also in sort of a geopolitical trap as well, and that's
Mr. Modi or Modi. Yes. Well, I mean, the problem for India is looming because what's happened is that because the Taliban have taken over in Afghanistan, what the Indians are worried about is the Taliban will again cooperate with the Pakistanis to stir up trouble in Kashmir and other places on the border, which threatens India, very much threatens India. Kashmir being ultra sensitive for India. And the other problem is that the U.S. now has no more bases in Afghanistan. The Kazakhstans and Uzbekistans are really very much afraid of getting involved anymore with Washington because they don't want to be left holding another bag, especially since they live next to Russia, not next to the United States. So the U.S. is looking for some place to put its troops and airplanes and guns and all this stuff. And what the Indians are afraid of is going to end up, they're going to ask, the U.S. is going to ask India for base rights. India should refuse, of course, but it's going to be a problem, something that, and by the way, the Indians are also, India, I should say, is also involved with the Chinese. I mean, it's not just a one-sided affair. You have the Quad on the one side, and you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on the other, which is run by China, has in it such nice place people as Russia and Iran and Pakistan. So I don't know what they're doing. I'm not sure they know what they're doing. But in any case, it makes the Quad look sillier by the minute.
And then we have another problem in the Indo-Pacific region with Taiwan. I note that former National Security Advisor Bob O'Brien and co-author Alexander Gray have talked in a Wall Street Journal op-ed about how to deter China from invading Taiwan. They suggested the so-called porcupine strategy and the acquisition of a whole plethora of U.S. Missiles and tactical vehicles and sea mines, etc. How realistic is their stuff? And on top of that, you got a brand new book by Elbridge Colby, The Strategy of Denial, in which he says basically the U.S. should defend Taiwan. And in his case, he's talking about positioning of naval forces and even troops essentially on Taiwan.
Right. Well, this is I think that he may be right in principle, but the chances of that happening are just about zero. The U.S. has no diplomatic relations with Taiwan officially. We treat them as a private company. We send private company people to represent us there. I mean, it's a lot of nonsense, but ever since 1979. As far as the proposal to have a porcupine approach with all these systems, by itself, it's not a bad idea. I mean, those are good weapons. They would probably stop an invasion from the sea and sink a lot of the Chinese craft coming in and challenge the Chinese Navy, which is a big Navy. So those things make some sense. That there's a deeper problem, I think, that, and by the way, I'm all for it, but I think that the real problem is that it's unlikely by any known scenario that little Taiwan, with 26 million people, 25, 26 million, somewhere in there, can defend itself against China with over 1 billion people and with a huge military compared to what's in Taiwan. It doesn't work. The best that can be hoped for in a conflict is that Taiwan can hold out until others can come in and help Taiwan. That's the thesis. Now, Taiwan has no security agreement with the United States. It has no security agreement with Japan. There's no security agreement with anybody. There's no promises from anybody in writing. Maybe oral promises have been made, I don't know, but there's nothing in writing. So essentially, Taiwan is essentially operating on a hope and a promise and a hope that maybe the U.S. will come and help, as it did in 1996. I was in Taiwan in the missile crisis in 1996. It took 2 weeks to get the U.S. carriers deployed because the Clinton administration didn't want to. And it was only finally when the Chinese started to mass troops and get them ready to get on landing, on ships to head for Taiwan that Clinton thought it might be a good idea to send the carriers. It was a very frightening time. As I said, I was in Taipei during all that. And I went with Jim Woolsey, who was the former head of CIA, and Admiral Bud Edney. So the three of us were there, and we were on the phones pleading with Washington, come on, you can't let this happen. Now, in 1996, when this happened, the Chinese backed off, and they backed off because they were afraid of the U.S. carriers and the kind of fight they would get into. They thought they would lose. So what did they do in those intervening years? They developed anti-carrier missiles so they could destroy our carriers maybe 1,000 miles away. And that's pretty frightening. Now, there's a debate about how effective they are. No one knows. The U.S. Navy says, not a problem. You say that as you're sitting in your rubber dinghy and the carrier is sinking off in the horizon. But the truth is we don't really know. What we do know is the Chinese have prepared for that kind of contingency, and that the president of the United States would have to take into consideration a much higher risk than he would have had to take into consideration in 1996, a much higher risk, if in fact he wanted to do it. But it's not clear to me that, in fact, Biden administration would want to do it. I have a feeling that the Biden administration would rather force Taiwan into some accommodation with China and walk away, because that's their MO. That's their MO. That's how they operate, their modus operandi. Same with, Iran. They don't want to have an argument with Iran. We'll make a nuclear deal. We'll all be happy. Oh, yeah, well, tell the Saudis to forget it, and the Kuwaitis to forget it, and the UAE to forget it, and the Israelis to forget it, and the Jordanians to forget it. Who needs them? We're going to make a deal with Iran. I mean, if they're willing to do that in the Middle East, they're going to be willing to do the same kind of thing in China, given the chance. Now, what's counterbalancing that is the Congress doesn't like China, and a lot of those are Democrats. So Biden doesn't have a free lunch here yet. Not yet. And maybe he never will. But I think that the danger of it is there. And especially as things get tense, and they're getting tenser by the day, because every day now the Chinese are sending fighter airplanes and surveillance airplanes around Taiwan, and bombers around Taiwan, circling the island, violating the ADIZ, the air defense zone around the island on a regular basis. And what does Washington say about it? Nothing. Not a word, not a peep, nothing. Have you heard anything? I haven't. They're just silent. And that's very dangerous. Washington should be raising holy hell about it, but not a word. So I think that's a harbinger of what we're going to see. And by the way, the Pentagon, I want to add one more thought to all this. and I have others, but this will do for now. The Pentagon has run simulations of what would happen if it intervened or tried to intervene. And in every case, the simulations seem to say that we would lose, that we would not be successful in defending Taiwan, and that our forces would be badly mauled and defeated. So the Pentagon is not enthusiastic in the least about getting into a contretemps with the Chinese. And they would be advising the president, well, Mr. President, you know, we can't be sure we can be successful. We may lose 5,000, 10,000 guys in trying to do this, and we may be worse than that. We may lose Japan. We may lose Okinawa. Do you really want to do that? That's the kind of thing the president's going to hear. That's what's going to happen.
Steve, that brings me to a question mark regarding the actions of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, during the transition period, reaching out to his Chinese PLA version, that's General Li Zhucheng, to say, no, we're not about to attack you at this point in time. And there's a scheduled hearing coming up later this month before the U.S. Senate to ask him as to whether or not that was an appropriate action on his part.
Well, he's supposed to, you know, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is supposed to report to the Secretary of Defense. That's his job. He reports to the Secretary of Defense. He doesn't act unilaterally. He goes to the Secretary of Defense. That's why we used to have, until this administration, first time since George Marshall, I think, that we used to have civilian leadership in the Pentagon for that reason. And then the Secretary of Defense reports to the president. That's how it's supposed to work. Well, Mr. Milley apparently did all this on his own without reporting, because the Secretary of Defense at the time says he never heard about it. So Milley did this on his own. I think it's inappropriate. It was wrong. I think that he was not coordinated properly. He was not following civilian authority properly, and thus he was not doing his job properly. So that's, I guess, what the Congress is going to look into. We'll see if they think that's the same way I think.
Turning to Israel and Iran, there was a recent article by the New York Times and many Israeli publications, particularly Haaretz, about an alleged Mossad high-tech AI remote.
Yes, the myth of the 1-ton robot.
Yes.
Who killed Fakhrizadeh. Well, isn't true. Let's start there. My mother would say it's a Bubba mindset. That means it's a story, an old lady's story. It was first reported in February of 2020 by a Jewish newspaper in London. And as a world exclusive. The New York Times essentially stole the story from a year and a half, I guess, before, from this London Jewish newspaper, and added a few interviews with people who have no names, which they claim they had interviews, and write this story, which was really a story intended to take up the position that the Iranians had originally promoted, that this was done by this robot. That was not the first story the Iranians put out. The first story put out he was assassinated, but no robot. And then they didn't think that was good enough, so they invented the robot. It was really the Revolutionary Guards in Iran that created this myth, and this robot somehow did this. There are only two pieces of physical evidence that we have. One is the car, which has been photographed, sitting in the middle of the road with 3 bullet holes through the windshield, which would go right through the head of Mr. Fakhrizadeh and kill him. But then there's no blood. And anyone knows when you shoot someone in the head like that, there's going to be blood all over the place. But there's no blood. And the story said there were 13 shots, but there's only 3 holes. So either the other bullets went right through the same holes, which I don't think is possible, or there weren't other bullets. And in fact, Mr. Fakhrizadeh wasn't even in that car, and his wife wasn't in that car either. They put the car there in the middle of the road and took a picture of it after they shot 3 holes in the windshield. That's my best understanding. We also have the second piece of evidence, which is Mr. Fakhrizadeh's body, which has been photographed lying in state in Tehran. No holes. Head looks great. Looks like he just, fell asleep. So what's going on here? Even more interesting, on the 15th, I think, on the 22nd of September, the Iranian government said, oh, there wasn't any robot. That's all nonsense. Of course, if you want to believe these guys about anything, good luck. But because they never tell the truth about anything anyway. But in any case, I don't think Fakhrizadeh died as a result of being shot by anybody. Certainly not in the head. Certainly not by a one-ton robot. By the way, there's a real undertone here of anti-Israel, anti-Semitism, because, the idea that these crafty Jews sitting in Tel Aviv, working for satellites, running this robot, were able to kill their top nuclear scientists of Iran. Isn't that horrible? These are horrible people, etc. You can add in all you want. That was the idea. That's what the New York Times was pushing. They kept saying, oh, this Fakhrizadeh is a great guy. Lovely man. Used to take his family to the seashore, do nice things. Well, he was building weapons of mass destruction intended to obliterate Israel. Come on, give me a break. There are a couple of possibilities. One is, he was at that age where sometimes people get a stroke or have a heart attack and die. So it's very possible he just fell over dead. It's also possible someone killed him, poisoned him, or something like that. Maybe he was leaking information to those horrible Israelis, or to those horrible Americans. The great Satan. And maybe he got caught. It's sort of like Rommel. You remember Rommel? He got caught plotting to kill Hitler. So they asked him to take poison, cyanide, and he did. Then they gave him a big state funeral, nice thing. Same here. It's utterly similar, and it smells to high heaven. So you take it from there. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that there wasn't any one-ton robot.
The new controversy that originated or erupted this past week concerning the Democratic, how shall I say it, progressive coalition getting $1 billion appropriation knocked out temporarily from a piece of the continuing resolution to finance the government. And it really caused consternation with, quote, centrist moderate Democrats and, of course, the GOP in the House. And we think that may be put on an appropriate independent track. And in fact, there's been a vote taken today that indicates that it has got the overwhelming support, with the exception of those so-called progressives in the House, to go forward to fund it.
Right. Well, it was a money bill, and because money bills originated in the House of Representatives. Right. We looked at that bill. We can't find $1 billion there for Iron Dome. We're finding $1.16 million, not $1 billion. It may well be that Ocasio-Cortez looked at it and mistranslated the 3 zeros at the top and said it was $1 billion when it was $100 million. Be that as it may, the Democrats have introduced legislation, which they'll quickly pass, I think, for $1 billion for Iron Dome. So Israel may come out a winner here with a large profit if it stays that way. It's a 2 or 3 year appropriation, so it's not just one shot. They don't get it all at once. But I also want to point out that this is a defensive system. This is one of the reasons Israel hasn't gone to war and just sent the army into Gaza and killed all those bastards, is because they've been able to shoot down the missiles and the balloons filled with explosives, carrying explosives, and the drones and anything else that they try to do. But they've been able to defend their to a certain extent, not perfectly, but I would say more perfectly than ever before against missile attacks. So there was money in the same bill for Arrow 3, but they didn't take that out. I just think it's funny. It's one of those curiosities. The Iron Dome is the most successful missile defense system ever built in the world. Nothing ever has performed that well. They've had over 2,500 missiles shot down by this system. It's a fabulous, successful system. And the money that was in the bill is primarily to buy rockets for the Iron Dome, interceptor rockets, that are made in the United States. So it's American jobs. It's not Israeli jobs, it's American jobs. So the whole thing is Pelosi should never have allowed it. She made a foolish mistake because she's a foolish person to allow something like this to happen. And the outcry against the Democrats is universal. It's not just Republicans.
Right.
The Democrats themselves are petrified because they get a large part of the Jewish vote in this country and an even larger part of Jewish campaign contributions. I mean, huge. And all that came under risk. And if they don't get this money put back in, and pretty damn fast, they'll never get another nickel, and they know it.
Steve, having said that the Iron Dome is, as you put it, one of the most successful missile defense elements, why is it in recent tests in New Mexico, the U.S. Army went out of its way to reject the acquisition?
Well, they didn't reject it based on the test because the Iron Dome performed flawlessly in the tests. They know that. They rejected it because they didn't want it. They never wanted it. And they still don't want it. And the Army wants to spend a lot of R&D money and create a lot of Army jobs building a system that may not work. If you put a successful piece in it, which is probably 2/3 of what they need, for what they had in mind, you can't spend all that money. You can't, and all these majors and colonels who want to leave the Army and go off and get jobs in industry won't be able to get them. I mean, that's the only. I think the Army's handling of missile defense as a general proposition has been a total mess. It's been, they not only killed Iron Dome, they also killed the program called MEADS, the Medium Extended Air Defense System, which was intended to be used by Europe and the US and NATO. And we put a couple of $1 billion into that, and one day they canceled it. Just go on. Why? It's a good system. It looks like a good system. It looks like it's going to be a great success. We just walked out.
You mentioned the Arrow 3. Wasn't that the subject of a test in Alaska? And
yeah, the Arrow 3 interceptor was used in Alaska with the ground-based interceptor system that we have that has not performed very well. And I think had just gone through some test that was less than 50% satisfactory, and that is the GD, ground-based GBI. And the Israelis were invited to bring the R3 up there to Greeley, Alaska, and test their interceptor with our radars and our control systems. By the way, integrating that was no problem. The Army put out this nonsense that, oh, it's going to be so hard to integrate it. They won't give us source code. It's really a mess. Didn't take a week or so to get it integrated. Anyway, they fired at two targets, which is typical, and they knocked them both out. These are ballistic missile targets, high in space, and they killed them both. Netanyahu was up there when this test took place, by the way. It was a great success. So R3 is a good system. Now, what the ground-based interceptor, we have 44 of those.
Correct. Pick a number at
Greeley and in Vandenberg. That's it, 44. And right now it's untrustworthy, and the Air Force, it's an Air Force program, is looking for possibly to design a new interceptor missile. Now, why didn't just buy the Arrow 3? I don't have an answer for that. They probably should have. It would have been at least an interim solution, far better than what we have. And anyway, most of it's made in the U.S. anyhow. And we own half of it. Half of it was built with U.S. money. So why not just take it and use it? Look, missile defense is very, very, very difficult. And particularly as missiles have decoys and they have multiple independent targeted warheads, and they are very hard to kill. Very hard to kill. I think in the end we're going to have to go to space-based defense, which is what President Reagan had proposed in the SDI program some years ago in the 80s. But I think that's the only way we have a chance to have missile defense. The difficulty is the reason we have so little of it is because the American scientific world is largely opposed to having missile defense in this country. They lived in Israel, they'd have a different attitude. Since they would have to decide whether it's their home or missile defense. I think they would choose missile defense. But here they don't make that decision, they don't care. So they're opposed. Why are they opposed? They're opposed because they believe in the MAD doctrine, MAD, mutually assured destruction. Meaning that if we would try to destroy Russia, they would destroy us. That's mutually assured destruction. And because of that, neither of us would ever use a nuclear rocket. Really? I mean, maybe with Russia, there's an argument you could make that it's worked to some extent. Although the Russians moved missiles into Cuba, and that was very frightening and could have changed the basis of the mutual imbalance. They could strike first and quickly, and they may be wiped out. So it's open to some doubt. But now with China expanding its nuclear arsenal significantly, and we have no treaties, no strategic arms limitation agreements, nothing with China. They don't agree to anything. With Iran, which has ICBMs now, with North Korea, which has ICBMs now, and atomic weapons. And maybe they're nuclear weapons. We're not too sure. We need missile defense. And unfortunately, in the last 20 years, we've made almost no progress, no serious progress. It's really dismal. It's a very shame. And it's sad because it endangers the whole world, in my opinion.
Well, it's not only your opinion, it's the opinion of others, including the rather talented designer of the Israeli triple layer ballistic missile and short range and intermediate range defense system, Uzi Rubin.
Yes.
Having written about him over a decade ago, he was very concerned about the ability of Iran to eventually threaten all of continental Europe, not only with possible nuclear warheads, but he said conventional stuff, not unlike what Nazi Germany did during World War II.
Right, but you never know what that missile has in its warhead.
That's correct.
How are you going to find out? You can't. There's no technology like that. So when it's flying toward you, you have to assume it's the worst. So if the Russians launched rockets at France, I don't think the French would hesitate 1 second to retaliate using their nuclear deterrent against the Russians. They had no choice. British too.
With Iran doing that too?
That's an interesting question. Depends who the target is.
Okay.
I mean, Israelis are going to be faced with that same dilemma.
Yes.
Once they confirm that Iran has nuclear weapons and that they're deployable. I think they already have them, by the way. So I'm in the minority on that, but I think they already have them. I think they've been running tests with the North Koreans. And I think the reason the North Koreans have started up their reactors is not to make more weapons for themselves. They want to make them for the Iranians. That's my humble opinion, but I could be wrong, but that makes sense to me that I know they cooperate on missiles. I know they've cooperated on nuclear stuff, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't cooperate on that.
Turning back to Israel for a second, there was an interesting.
And they need the money because they're broke. They're in bad financial shape. So, if the Iranians said, okay, 10 billion, can you make a dozen of these? Sure. Why not? Just don't put our name on it.
It's caught in a dilemma these days as a result of not only the discussion we had about the Iron Dome, but other matters as well. And the question arises as to whether or not the country really is at a point where it should be self-reliant when it comes to these threats.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has always been the case. It was the case with tanks years ago. So Israel developed its own tank, the Merkava. It was a case with airplanes. So they tried to build their own Kafir fighters, and then they tried to build a Lviv, but they couldn't afford it, or they would have. The problem is that Israel's quite a small country, all things being equal, and the R&D costs and the development and manufacturing and all the rest, and the burden that puts on the country is very great. So I don't know if it's realistic, except in specific categories, whether it's realistic to go on your own. The problem with Iron Dome is a developed system. Yes, I mean, it's already there. Yeah, they can tweak it and they can improve it and they can integrate it and they can do different things. But basically, the investment for Iron Dome has been made, and largely with U.S. money. Okay, but what Iron Dome needs is ammunition. And it's expensive. Every time you shoot down a $20 rocket with a $16,000 missile, it starts to pinch. And when they shoot down 2,500 of them, which means about 5,000 missiles were launched by Israel against the threat, that's 5,000 times 16,000. You figure out the math, but it's a big number. And that goes right to the Treasury. And that doesn't count all the other costs that are involved in maintaining such systems and personnel and training and everything and replenishment and all the rest. So this is not inexpensive. How's Israel going to carry that burden by itself, even if it could? I mean, is it going to make its own interceptor missiles? It could. But it's going to take a huge industrial effort that they don't need to do, and there's no reason for it. So, I mean, I think any country in the world worries about being dependent on somebody else. You know, if you don't have to be dependent, it's a great idea. And well, people will say, well, the U.S. isn't dependent on anything. Oh, yes, we are. We're dependent on integrated circuits that come from Taiwan and Japan, okay, and Korea. We're dependent on rare earth materials that come from China. We're dependent on titanium that comes from Russia. I mean, and you can go on and on. I mean, we're depending on, we have a lot of dependencies. Not, even though we're a big and powerful country with a big, huge workforce and all kinds of assets, but we still have dependencies. And, I just want to mention that, that space station up there has been supported by Russian rockets up until recently. Okay. And the replenishment launch, the second to the latest one was SpaceX, but the one right before that, which was launched in Virginia, which was a rocket that had 2 Russian engines in it. American rocket with 2 Russian engines. It was successful. It worked fine, but dependent. Well, the guys in the space station are dependent. They want to eat, so they want those deliveries. So anyway, I mean, I think it's a very difficult question and hard to answer. Wherever you can be independent, or where you can have a strategic reserve, or where you can have strategic manufacturing, you want to do that. But it's very burdensome for a small country.
Well, I want to thank you for this wide-ranging discussion on items that I think are vitally important for the world, the United States, for Israel, for Taiwan, and Australia. Please do our best to your lovely wife, Shoshana, and we'll hear back from you.
Good. Thank you, Jerry. Take care of yourself. Bye.
Bye.